Hi everyone, welcome to another bi-weekly webinar with WorkUp. A couple of weeks ago we gave a webinar about complex projects, and today the idea is to kind of keep on capitalizing on that subject of complex projects and how to implement those types of projects within WorkUp. So we talked a little bit about the Kanban method and the Waterfall method and the Gantt chart tools within the last webinar. Today we're going to focus that a little bit more with regards to waterfall methodology. So we'll talk about what it is, what the difference between Kanban and waterfall methodology is, and how those types of projects can be implemented within WorkUp, and how those projects would kind of look within WorkUp. So the first thing to talk about with regards to waterfall methodology and WorkUp is to keep in mind that WorkUp wasn't necessarily designed for these types of methods and projects. It was more towards, our focus was more towards agile teams and lean project management. However, we kind of wanted to create like this hybrid in which agile teams could use some waterfall method tools like the Gantt chart, and time tracking and all those types of tools. So you will notice that WorkUp is a hybrid between Kanban methods and waterfall methods. Now, Kanban methods are super explicit within WorkUp. They're straight to the point with the card system and the section systems and the table systems. But waterfall methodology isn't explicit within WorkUp. That's why we've decided to kind of start this webinar, because we feel that because it's not super explicit, we want to give you like some tips and tricks on how to make it more efficient while working with waterfall and WorkUp. So let's just get started. Before we dive into WorkUp itself, I kind of want to show you, we did create an article within our blog, within the WorkUp blog, that explicitly explains what the difference between Kanban methods and Gantt charts and waterfall methods are. So I recommend that you have a read through it because it's pretty descriptive and it gives you all of the important aspects of the two. So what I'll do today is I'll go over just the more summarized version of the difference between the two and how you can work through it within WorkUp. But yeah, I recommend you have a look at this blog post. It's really good. It was written by Diego, one of our teammates. So it's really good. Have a look at it, and yeah. So let's just dive right into WorkUp. As you know, if you are a first-time user of WorkUp, every time that you sign in, you have to give permission to Google that you are allowing access to your accounts through WorkUp. So that's the basics of signing in for those of you who are just joining us. This is the team dashboard. This is where you'll have access to all your teams. If you're a premium user, you'll have unlimited teams within WorkUp. If you're a free user, you only have one team with up to 10 users. So I have various teams within my WorkUp account, and today we'll be going into more along the lines of how the WorkUp sales team manages their tasks. So I'm more inclined to waterfall methods because I'm a certified project manager, and I particularly like this method. It's a lot more descriptive. It's a lot more complex, but I think it fits well with the sales team. I think it fits well with the projects, and overall, the types of projects that we manage within the sales team are more inclined to this type of management. So with waterfall methods, it's very important to know that, or analyze what types of projects you have in your hands. We talked about this in the last webinar, but I want to go over it once again because it's super important that you analyze the type of project you're working with. So if it's a short-term project and your team is just composed of around 2 to 5 team members, project deadline is very close. It's only a 3-month type of project, not a lot of tasks, not a lot of breakdown. So that's a pretty easy to manage type of project, and it's not very complex. It's quite simple, so it doesn't really require these types of methods to manage them, you can do so, but it'll kind of be a little bit overkill. Waterfall methods are more inclined for more complex projects because they have a lot of activities. They require the management of a bigger team, so usually teams with more than from 5 to 10 to 15 people. The duration of the project is a lot longer, so definitely waterfall methods is more inclined to complex projects. So yeah, let's get started with how what I want to do with this webinar is I want to give you an example. I don't want to like talk to you about the theory. I want to give you an example of how in WorkUp we use the waterfall method for our sales strategy plan. So our marketing team uses Agile, our sales team uses Waterfall. Why? Because our sales projections and our sales projects are more long term. The team is pretty big, and our objectives are pretty long term. So we've decided to use this method. So how did we go about this whole waterfall method within the sales team? So I'll take you through it step by step. So the first thing that we did was we broke down the work externally from WorkUp. Now this is something super important that I always recommend the users, especially when they're working with complex projects. Users that have a lot of activities within their projects, they should always break down those activities and break down the work externally from WorkUp because as you'll notice, every time that you create a new project, it's going to be basically a blank canvas. Let's do an example. A blank canvas, and once you open it and you create a project, you have to input all of the information. Now this is going to take a lot of time. It's going to be very time consuming, especially for the project manager. So what I recommend is that instead of just going with the canvas and just starting off with the canvas and typing along as you go and creating the tasks as you go, I suggest you use a work breakdown structure, either through mind mapping or through an actual work breakdown structure in a Blackboard or anything like that. Sticky notes, I'm fond of sticky notes, but at WorkUp we found this really neat app called Coggle, and it's free and it's really easy to use, and it's basically just a breakdown of the different parts or phases of the project and the different activities that need to go down with it. You start creating it and it's really easy, so I recommend you use it as well. But anyways, this is how we used it in WorkUp. So we broke down the work externally from the platform, and then once that work was identified, it was a lot easier for us to come in and just simply start inputting information within the platform. So with the different colors, you can identify, okay, so this is going to be a section, these are going to be the tasks, these are going to be the subtasks. So this makes it a lot easier because then you don't have to be thinking about all of the different activities while you start typing down. Then it can get too time consuming. So if you already have your activities identified, then it's just a matter of implementing that information within WorkUp and you're good to go. So let's go into an example of how those tasks may look within WorkUp. So this is what I kind of did with my project. So something that I want to also something that I want to point out with regards to complex projects and waterfall methods is that because WorkUp is so easy to use and so simple, and it only has 5 levels to work with. You have the team level, you have the project level, and then you have section level, the actual task, which is the 4th level, and then the 5th task, which is the subtask. So because you are pretty constrained by the levels within WorkUp, breaking down your work is going to be very limited. So just be conscious of that, or just be mindful of that when you're breaking down your work. So obviously you can play around with this. I played around with it in the sense that because the project had a lot of different levels to it, it had around 6 to 7 levels, I started working around with what I had within WorkUp. So instead of making, for example, these teams actual teams, what some users and what we do at WorkUp is that we'll create a team as if it was a project. So instead of it being the actual team, it's actually going to be called the project name. So if you bring the project name up that level, then once you go into these private projects and these shared projects, they can actually be treated as more as mini projects or as or as the different phases within the project, and that gives you those extra levels, because then once these are, as you can see, these are actually mini projects. They're not the overall main mother project. They're just mini projects that I did within the private project section, so that I can break down the work into much more manageable parts. Um, and I was able to analyze this type of planning or movement of the different parts of the project, because I the first thing I did was kind of broke down the work externally. So as you can see, all of these little um, lines represent those different types of breakdowns that I did with regards to the project. So going back to the mini projects and the mini phases, well, because I was able to create those side mini projects, I would then was able to create these sections that were more inclined to. So these are the mini projects, and then these would be the phases of those mini projects. So again, helping me organize the work into much more manageable and easier to understand um, organization. So another thing that's really important with regards to the waterfall method. This is the what technically speaking, this is the waterfall method. You first have to identify the work that's being done based on the list of requirements that you have in your hands. You lay down, you break down the work that needs to be done, you set up deliverables, you set up objectives, and then these objectives, to achieve them, you need to have tasks, different activities that need to be done so that you can achieve all these deliverables. So again, it's not super explicit within WorkF, but there are ways in managing this type of, or this level of project management. So what I did, what I did externally from WorkF, so that I can have all these different parts of the waterfall method, is that I created a Google Sheets document that laid out all that information that was super important for me. So because this is a long-term project, it was divided into different milestones. Milestones, I'll explain a little bit later how they can be added within your Gantt chart, but for the purposes of this example that I'm bringing to you now, what I did was I created a Google Sheets that is connected to my WorkF project. It's within the file section, not this project, but in the old project, it was connected within the file section so that I could easily access it at any time. So the objectives were laid out, the deliverables were laid out, the project completion date was laid out as well. And then it was super explicit to me and the team what our objectives and what our deliverables were for this type of project. Now, with the deliverables in mind, and with our breakdown, and with our different organized, or with our organization of the different parts of the project, I was then able to further break down the work, and organize who needs to do what, and who needs to be accountable for the different parts of the project. So what I did to manage that was that I used the classic Rossi chart. Now again, this is another classic tool of the waterfall method. So for those of you who don't know what the Rossi is, Rossi means responsibility, accountability, consulted, and informed. So these are the different characteristics that the team is going to have, or the team is going to be assigned to them. So responsibility was then assigned across the board with the different activities that I identified using the Coggle sheet. I was able to identify the different activities that needed to be done to get our objectives and deliverables executed. And then I assigned across the board accountability, responsibility. I identified who needed to be consulted, who needed to be informed within the team of the different activities. So as you can see, this is a classic Rossi chart. Now, again, this is super broken down. I honestly don't recommend that you go into this level of breakdown within WorkF, because that's actually not the point of WorkF. Because it's a hybrid between agile and waterfall, we do want to keep trying to keep things simple for you. The only reason that I did this level of breakdown was because for the purposes of accountability and responsibility, I just wanted to make sure that everybody knew what they were doing. And then what I did within WorkUp is that I only put the headlines. I only put the big activities within the WorkUp plan, and everything was explicit after that. If someone wanted to go more in depth into their activities, they could have just simply gone into the Google Sheets and then broken down those activities and seen the whole breakdown of that activity per se. So again, we're going into more complex topics, but it is part of the waterfall method to use the Rossi chart, because it kind of keeps things super clear on who needs to do what and by when. So once the Rossi chart was determined, then we could go into estimates. Now, estimates is a huge part of the waterfall method, because within agile methodology, what teams do is that they'll manage their time through sprints. So every 15 days, we have a set of activities that we need to do, that we need to make sure that we accomplish those activities by those 15 days. And if the activities aren't accomplished within those 15 days, then the activities that were not done would go into a backlog, and then they'll be worked with within the next sprint. But as you can see, it's a lot of short-term planning. Whereas waterfall method is not short-term planning at all. So sometimes you can have activities with durations of hundreds of days or a duration of 1 hour. So it's very varied, and I honestly feel like the best way in which you can manage these types of estimates is by first laying out all the activities that you need to do, and then analyzing how many days each of those activities you think is going to last. So what I did first was that I went, okay, so this activity is going to last 10 days. So instead of the classical method would be, if you've used tools like Microsoft Project, the classic would be you would have to assign manually the actual 10 days within time duration. However, the good thing is, because WorkUp is a hybrid, you wouldn't have to do that. With the Gantt chart in WorkUp, it's as simple as like you identify the activity and you go, okay, so this activity is actually supposed to last. It's actually supposed to last a couple more days. All you have to do is stretch it out, and you can assign exactly how long a task is going to last. So that makes things a lot simpler for you. So here is where WorkUp really helps you out, especially if you are using Gantt chart and the waterfall method. Because in the traditional tools, you would have to manually set up, okay, this has to last from May 14th to July 31st. That's not very practical. That's very time consuming. So what we wanted to do is like speed up that process, and we can just simply do that for you. You can drag and drop the task into different parts of the calendar. You can quickly toggle the subtask to see what subtasks you have within that task. You can even move the subtask as well and assign due dates, start and end dates to the subtasks. So again, making that whole process of planning within the Gantt chart a lot easier for you. You can quickly add dependencies, and then those dependencies will then be connected, and you can move those dependencies across the board. So again, we're trying to make things a lot simpler for the users and for teams, just so they can manage their projects in a much more efficient way. But they can still use traditional methods like waterfall. So going back to my estimates. So now that you've determined duration, this is another thing. This is another important aspect of the waterfall method that I think should be pointed out. You should always determine duration before starting to implement duration within the scheduling. Because once you've already determined the duration externally, going back into WorkUp and simply just dragging and dropping is going to be a lot quicker for you and a lot easier for the project manager. So once duration is set up, you don't have to do this. This is me micromanaging, but it's just an example of how I like to do my management. But once you add duration and you add it in WorkUp, and if you want to add it within the Google Sheets just to make it a little bit more complete, then you can do so. The reason why we do duration within the waterfall methodology is because cost is also an important factor of the waterfall method. So estimate time duration is done so that we can then make some estimates about some costs. So what the activity is going to cost us, and what how that might affect the overall budget of the project. So all projects have a budget. So we have to plan accordingly to that budget. So we have to make sure that we don't go over budget or that we don't have any overruns with during the actual execution of the project. So the way that is managed or overseen is that you make some initial planned costs and you make some initial planned times. So you are then able to compare what was planned versus what actually happened. So now this is another important aspect of the waterfall method. This is actually one of the most important aspects because it'll allow us to oversee or just take into consideration that we have this assigned cost to this particular activity. So this means that this activity cannot overrun more than 2 or 3 days because the impact in the cost would be too great, and the impact in cost would be um, not favorable for the overall budget of the project. So these are other topics that we'll go over a little bit later or within the next webinar. But just long story short, it's very important that you take into consideration what was planned versus what actually happened. So another thing that WorkUp allows you to do is precisely that. You can oversee how long, how many days you overran a certain activity. So let's, for example, this one right here. When it's in green, that just means that you are ahead of schedule. So you've completed this task 4 days before the deadline, which is beneficial because that means you save money, that means you save time doing that task 4 days um, before schedule. But what happens when you complete a task 4 days after the schedule? So we'll also give you that information. That information is going to be in yellow, and you will tell you how many days it took you to complete that task after the deadline. So again, behind schedule and ahead of schedule information will be given to you within the Gantt chart within WorkUp. And then that's super important for your project reporting, because if you planned an hour for this activity, for example, and it actually took you 30 minutes to do this activity, you actually saved time. You actually saved half of the budget or half of the assigned budget for this particular activity by you doing the task ahead of time. But what happens when you didn't take 30 minutes, or you didn't take that hour and you actually took 2 hours? Then that's going to have a negative impact on your actual costs, and that will eventually ripple into, again, a waterfall effect in which one part of the project is contaminated or affected negatively. The rest of the project is going to be affected negatively as well. So that's one of the constraints of the waterfall method. Because everything is so micromanaged and so tied, you need to make sure that you make a plan, or a project plan that is equally as flexible and adaptable to these types of changes. Because if you super micromanage a project, you could run into the issue or the potential risk of you did some bad estimates. Just something as simple as bad estimating, which tends to happen. Maybe it wasn't the team's fault that they completed the task 1 hour later. Maybe it was just simply a matter of bad estimates. So you need to make sure that whenever you do planning, that's why I always encourage the users to plan externally from WorkUp, so that the information and the data within your WorkUp Gantt chart, or the information within WorkUp does not seem so affected if things don't go according to plan. Another good thing about WorkUp is precisely that it's flexible and adaptable to change. So if you do need to make any changes in duration of a certain task, you can easily do so. So, and it won't affect the overall progress of the project and the information within the project. So that's a little bit blessing and a curse, because sometimes we don't really want so much flexibility, but we do want, at the end of the day, it's always better to have a tool that does have that flexibility and adaptability rather than it not having it, because then it will affect the overall team morale if activities are not done by the time they're set up, and if the reasons why it's not done is not necessarily the team's fault. So going back into the estimates, so now you can see that all my budget and all my cost estimates are done externally from WorkUp. We don't really have a way in which we can include those types of cost or budget estimates within WorkUp. What I tend to do is that to add that extra level, what I'll do is I'll use the tags precisely to identify how much time I need to spend in a particular task. So then it's explicit for the team within WorkUp just to see, okay, so within this task, I need to spend 1 hour, or I have a maximum of 1 hour to spend in this task, and they'll take that into consideration. So, but the overall cost, you could use the tags to identify cost per activities, but I feel like that would be a bit overkill. I don't think it's super necessary, especially if you have a Google Sheet that complements your WorkUp information. So yeah. So basically, that's all for today with regards to the waterfall method, because this is part one. In part two, we will be talking about project reporting within the waterfall method. We'll be talking about team management within the waterfall method, and other important elements of this type of methodology and WorkUp. We'll go into a much more in-depth analysis of how we can use the WorkUp's Gantt chart for various waterfall method tools and techniques, especially reporting, and especially the different visualizations, and most importantly, the sharing of information of the Gantt chart with external stakeholders. Because when we have complex projects and we have projects especially that fall in line with the waterfall method, it's super important that stakeholders are always informed, and that stakeholders are properly identified, and the information is effectively shared with them at all times. So we have a couple of tips and tricks on how to share WorkUp information with external stakeholders without having to invite them into the actual project. So we'll go in depth into that next time. So what I want to do now is take the time to answer your questions. If you have any specific questions about what I've been talking about now, that would be great. Okay, if there's no questions, I'll leave my email, and you can contact me if you have any specific questions. If not, we'll see you on